The German panic can likely be attributed to the events of the past few hours. That is, by Russia's effort to expand its strategic bomber factory in Kazan. This is Sergei Gorbunov's factory in Kazan, where Tupolev's strategic bombers are assembled and modernized. 22. Say a word about these planes, which have obviously been improved since their first version.
Fortunately, because normally it should have been retired from service for several decades now and replaced by a superior additional version. They have aircraft over 50 years old that they continue to improve. But on top of that, they're behind compared to what, for example, Western countries can do, and I'm not even talking about the United States. China has more modern versions of this aircraft. And so the Russians are simply trying to stay at a level that allows them to continue to be relatively relevant. Their engine maintenance is incredibly extensive, requiring dozens of hours, approximately 40 hours of maintenance for a single hour of flight. So we're dealing with an operating cost that is absolutely disproportionate. It's an aircraft that has no stealth capability. Its electronics are very old, meaning it's vulnerable to navigation warfare. If its global positioning system is jammed, it will almost get lost due to the lack of precise inertial navigation systems like ours. So overall, it's an aircraft. They can't stay stuck in the 80s because they're already outdated. Obviously, they don't stand a chance, even against a country like Ukraine, which is going to equip itself with
Western jammers. Yet how can we explain that there is still fear? That is, we can clearly see the show of force with the B-2. We saw the American B-2, which is a kind of super plane worth $3 billion. And we have these Tupolevs, which are obviously, as you explained very well, from a much older and more basic version. So
these are aircraft, nevertheless, that have a relatively significant carrying capacity. They can launch several dozen, for example, cruise missiles. Today, our problem is lacking the numbers. Ukraine is the sole European nation that can intercept 250 missiles in a single night. Regrettably, around 50 still get through, but no other European country can match this capability. We are utterly incapable of achieving what Ukrainians have done daily for 3 years. So the Germans, seeing this, are in good faith and they're worried. Obviously, you have to imagine that the Russians, when they launch Ki-101 missiles at Ukraine from their own airspace, their missiles are capable of hitting Paris while flying at very low altitude and so on. And indeed, you need a certain number of layers of air defense to intercept them. The Ukrainians, supplied with resources from us and their own local developments, dispatch fighter jets to intercept the missiles. But overall, if there is a ceasefire, if there are negotiations, if Russia maintains high production rates for 3 years, they could amass 10 to 20,000 missiles, ready to launch at us within days. Additionally, they overwhelm everything. Before continuing, a brief message from our partner, who enables us to create these videos. Today it's NordVPN. You know, a VPN first allows you to appear in a region where you're not actually located. It lets you access content that's not available from your own region. For example, sports might be free in some foreign countries. You can also watch movies early when they're released in the United States, streaming them. When traveling abroad, you can set your location to France to continue watching your content as if you were at home. The second thing is security. Have you heard that story about journalists who connected to an airplane's Wi-Fi? Hackers were able to track all their conversations, whereas if they had connected with NordVPN, in that case, all the data traffic would have been encrypted and therefore unreadable to hackers. The third point, which I see very regularly, is there are free VPNs on the internet. You know what free VPNs are? Chinese group Advanced Persistent Threat 41 exploited a vulnerability in a free VPN. That allowed them to infiltrate aviation and industrial organizations. They were able to steal personal data and insert backdoors so they could quietly return later to the computers they had managed to infect. To get all these benefits, use my exclusive link, nordvpn.com/titleman. That way, you can travel and keep appearing wherever it suits you. You'll have complete security, and you'll even get services that are often cheaper when you choose the right regions. All right, let's get back to our topic.
Whether it's this recent war with Iran or even over the years, we've seen what the Israelis are capable of doing. With their 3 levels of air defense at the same time, against drones, against rockets, against different kinds of missiles and different speeds, we don't have that. The Ukrainians today intercept a lot, but if we had, for example, what the Iranians launched at Israel, I think we would have had much more.
We're incapable. There are 3 generations. Technologically, we chose not to develop the superior version, which can intercept missiles traveling at 15,000 kilometers per hour. The latest version of the missiles supplied to Ukraine, the B and NT, was developed for the United States but not provided to Ukraine. It is capable of intercepting missiles that travel at 5,000 kilometers per hour. And the French surface-to-air missile platform T, the Mamba surface-to-air missile platform, IT, intercepts Kinjal hypersonic missiles every day. How much does it cost? Each interception will cost several €100,000. And us, Xavier, how many do we have? It's the same thing.
For the Kinjal, the laser is much cheaper. And the Mamba batteries, how many do we have for our national defense?
If I'm not mistaken, it's about a dozen. A dozen. That means we deploy them in Paris on the nuclear bases.
On the sites, that's it. Very sensitive about the level of preparedness. Obviously, France has great nuclear power, but you're telling us that in reality, France couldn't fend off a missile attack as things stand.
Russian. Especially since we know about the leaks that happened last October, that Russia is preparing to bomb our sites in France from their ships. If they ever attack, we were talking about it in Narva earlier, what are they going to do? Are they going to prevent France from bringing in a second wave of troops to reinforce? They bomb our airports, railways, and electrical installations from the Air Force and Navy. And they did reveal that they've developed missiles and Shahed drones that can be launched from cargo ships. You have a civilian ship passing by in the distance, the very last container on top of its cargo. It opens up the possibility for them to launch hundreds of Shaheds, potentially overwhelming our defenses. Even if our defense can fully intercept, we're discussing Ilong, the base for a nuclear submarine. Yes, individually, it is technologically capable of intercepting these kamikaze drones. With the sheer number, there will inevitably be some that get through.
Why is Putin investing heavily in his flying anvils? As Xavier said, today war has changed. You have to put money into technology, into drones, that's it. These planes will take off and get easily destroyed by modern fighter bombers like the F-35 and F-16. Rafale, and even Rafale, of course, even Rafale. I feel like it's a bit of propaganda, though. You shouldn't let yourself get too influenced by this kind of announcement.
Or by fake setups, I would say. But it's also to make people forget about the cancellation of the Penetrating Counter-Air Developmental Aircraft Program. The successor to the Tupolev Tu-160, which were planes that were supposed to be built from scratch. The sanctions prevent them from getting this equipment today. The radar plane A-100 can't be used due to the lack of necessary cooling and power generation technologies. They've abandoned some programs, so they're pretending to fall back on these devices. The remarks?
Vladimir Putin's words are resonating across much of Europe tonight.
There is a certain logic in the combat operations, and the troops find themselves in different territories. But, we have this old saying, which is neither a proverb nor a parable, but an old rule. Wherever a Russian soldier sets foot,
it's ours.
For a number of decades and centuries, Germany was the enemy of France, and today, in the same way, there is a militarism.
Russian. Imperialism has always existed, and today, Russia is the only remaining imperialist power, reminiscent of a 19th century colony. So it's tense. And then there's also the question of the Russian soldiers' presence. Does that also apply to Poland? Does it apply to the Netherlands? Does it apply to Georgia? There's also an interesting phrase at the beginning of his statement. I consider Russians and Ukrainians to be one people. In that sense, all of Ukraine is ours. And she says that, and after that she says, anyway, when we arrive, it's ours. But Ukraine is already ours anyway.
Anyway, it's Russia. How can we understand the conventional war effect of Russia? This is the latest information about tank production, the production of T-90 tanks. That's the most modern they have, the T-90M. Observe the changes from the year Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 through 2023, 2024, and 2025. There is an effort to produce tanks. Here, it's really a completely conventional attack. The problem is,
it takes Russia 10 years of production to replenish the military stock they had before invading Ukraine. And then it's not really the T-90M. Let me remind you, the T-90M is a tank that includes Western components, notably cameras, infrared systems, and French fire control systems. While not a source of pride, French technology is present in their helicopters, fighter jets, and tanks. Now they no longer have access to it. So, these are T-90Ms, not as good as the ones they had at the time of the invasion. They're at a level where they might be able to produce some 300 per year, 300 per month, given the level of losses they've suffered so far. That's not enough to launch major assaults again, because they're still losing several dozen and only producing about one a day. Even if they keep pulling out Soviet stockpiles that they more or less modernize, it's clearly not enough to keep the war going, simply at the current pace. They need to acquire more resources or establish a ceasefire to rebuild their maneuvering force, as I mentioned earlier. This is the sole scenario where after a 1-2 year break, they could resume their offensive against Ukraine or the Netherlands, for instance.
For example, there was even a time when Russia clearly had some difficulties with the summer offensive. It's the Telegraph that says Russia is starting to stagnate. Moscow's campaign to advance deeper into Ukraine is failing. Just a few weeks after its launch, for example, Russian forces seem to have completely lost control. After returning to the region in January, Russian troops failed to make any progress. Observe this Sumy region closely, following it almost meter by meter.
For once, it's really an area where we had some concerns. When the Ukrainians had to leave Kursk, pushed by the Americans and by Russian and North Korean pressure, we actually thought that the 70,000 Russians facing them would more or less stop. In reality, they continued advancing, with progress reaching several dozen square kilometers daily. There was fear due to improperly built defensive lines. That is to say, the war has evolved so much in 3 years that the Ukrainians had built defensive lines that matched the needs of 2022, meaning with tank columns, so anti-tank trenches, and they hadn't made trenches with roofs. I'm in contact with French fighters in that region. They made some reconquests there, going back on the offensive. Despite their numbers, the Russians still have clearly inferior equipment. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, they are supported by troops who are indeed very well trained. Their equipment is fewer in number, but when available, their tanks have superior aiming and artillery has longer range. That's what makes the difference and allows them to gradually regain ground. The Russians repeated their 2024 mistake when they focused their efforts on Sumy instead of Kharkiv, resulting in failure.
So how can we explain the very ambiguous statement from the Chief of Staff? Thierry Burkhardt of the Armed Forces says yes. Russia is facing great difficulties, it has lost a lot of resources, and yet it might hold out 5 minutes longer than we do. What does that mean coming from Burkhardt? Listen to what he's saying tonight.
My assessment of the situation is that today, in fact, if we look at things objectively, as of today, in a snapshot, Russia is undergoing a strategic defeat. Russia's attack, in fact, is a form of military disaster, a military disaster. Because if we're having trouble counting the men, nevertheless, it's certain that we're talking about a few 100,000 men lost, dead, or wounded, which is a bit beyond our imagination today. I think that obviously Russia, when it attacked on February 24th, its goal was not, after 3.5 years, to have conquered just a little more or barely 20% of Ukrainian territory, but to win in a few months. The Chief of the Defense Staff, again...
Once again, he's not just any ordinary analyst. The head of the French army fears Russia might outlast them by 5 minutes in a potential conflict.
Resilient, she's resilient, yes. In reality, there are two ways to win a war. Either it's because we manage to achieve victories, meaning we make progress, we manage to break through the front, we manage to invade the enemy, and we manage to defeat them militarily. It's over. Neither Russia nor Ukraine will succeed unless suddenly Trump decides to give thousands of tanks to Ukraine. I don't believe it, unfortunately. The other option is attrition, and here we're in a war of attrition. The first one to get tired, the first one to give up. Ukraine's allies halt equipment supply as Russia stops receiving shells from North Korea. Logically, it's that side that will be forced to stop defending itself or else stop making progress. And so we'll reach a kind of ceasefire. And here, what the head of the armed forces is saying is simply that there's a fear Ukraine, due to insufficient assistance and its limited economy, is forced and compelled to take certain actions. It's a smaller country, it will end up being the one that has to give up. This means there will be other cities like Bakhmut and Mariupol that will be invaded and destroyed.
Can Putin be the one, can he be the one who always opposes Putin more and more? There's a new Trump who is starting, in his tone, to show himself toward Vladimir Putin. Listen to him saying, for example, for the first time that he believes Putin's ambitions could go beyond Ukraine.
Your Chief of Staff, General Kane, said that Mr. Putin has territorial ambitions that go far beyond Ukraine. Do you see things the same way?
Yes, that's very possible. I know he would like to get out of this whole situation.
Complicated. He called me last time. He told me if he could
help me
in Iran, and I told him, no, if he could help me, it's in Russia. Is this a new Trump we're witnessing? The Trump who boasts about his B-2s, who is obviously more satisfied being a war leader than we thought? At first,
when he arrived, he was determined to cut all budgets, including military ones. And then there was the preparation of the military budget, and we analyzed it here on this set. All of a sudden, the United States military budget was going to go from $800 billion per year, which is already considerable, to $1 trillion per year. And at the same time, Musk was criticizing this budget and distancing himself from Trump. And clearly at that moment, Trump said, it's because of the risk posed by China in the Indo-Pacific, that is, China's proven maritime expansionism and Russian expansionism in Eastern Europe. He mentioned Russia.
He mentioned Russia, and Pete Hegseth repeated it, emphasizing Russia. So there is still that in the United States. They considered the Russian threat, albeit without strong willingness, at least in the documentation. They don't feel
Themselves, they obviously don't feel
threatened. But
we can't deny Vincent. We're going to listen to Vincent. And we can't deny that there has been a shift, it seems to me, in the Russian strategy.
In the American strategy? No, so once he has made this announcement, once he acknowledges the European risk, is he going to stop withdrawing forces from Europe? Is he going to help his allies? Is he going to commit to respecting Article 5? Is he eventually going to help Ukraine as he could? We learned that more than 100 fighter jets will be leaving the United States next year without fighter jets. That are leaving the fleet, just like the F-16 and the others, fine, give them. Rather than paying to dismantle them, it costs millions to pay to dismantle them. We actually saved money on some equipment that we gave to the Ukrainians. It saved us from having to dismantle it. We give it to the Ukrainians.
that's his doctrine. He won't go to war. He'll follow. And then to say we have won when he only said a few words, and that's what
Vincent from the Europeans is waiting for something specific. That was actually told to us by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who said, but you are Europeans. So the Euro-Atlantic Front, it's up to you, Mr. Xavier, to defend it. You are Europeans. It's not up to me. And there you go. And so, indeed, just as the Israelis are the first to defend themselves, and they like that, Trump comes to the rescue of victory.
That's exactly it. I'm not sure they have as much respect and love for us. And that makes
We hinder our own development, independence and sovereignty by allowing others to undermine our defense efforts. When we win contracts in Australia, they stab us in the back and spy on us. I could go on a long tirade about the Americans. But today, when they tell us your industry's rotten and you're not armed enough, well, yes, whose fault is that? It's like when they go to Japan and say, hey, your army is lousy. Japan's agreements prevent it from arming itself. Long live armament.
Goal is France, and long live Europe's strategic autonomy.
When you see that Ukraine couldn't avoid a Russian attack because it doesn't have nuclear weapons, when you see that Iran is still was trying to get nuclear weapons, and considering that it would somehow protect it against the West, the Germans are now, in a truly spectacular way, seeking nuclear protection. This is an article from Politico about a very important figure in Germany who is the head of the party. It's Jens Spahn, who is the head of the Christian Democratic Union, which is the ruling party, the party of Merz. Well, in a coalition, a top political leader, the Christian Democratic Union declares that the country will have to participate in a European nuclear umbrella. Otherwise, it risks becoming an international pawn. Jens Spahn's remarks are truly striking. He says, we should debate an independent European nuclear umbrella, and that will only work with German leadership. Well, of course, the Germans who
take the leadership conducted in deterrence on the French armies.
You obviously don't like that. No, I don't
like it at all. That's not it. I refuse it outright. And first of all, I'm against nuclear proliferation because I think there's already enough nuclear power around the world. We've seen that nuclear games are very dangerous. In 1962, we came within a hair's breadth of a catastrophe between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. In 1999, during the Kargil War, we came within a hair's breadth of a catastrophe between Pakistan and India. It was even acknowledged by a general.
Wait, why did the Germans have all the viewpoints on this panel? But shouldn't the Germans also have the right to the bomb?
So today, they have the American NATO atomic bomb, which they can only use on Donald Trump's orders. If American allies feel threatened or their interests misaligned with the United States president, they can't maintain sovereignty. It's understandable that a significant European country like Germany would seek nuclear deterrence. They have two options. Either they continue to be under someone else's umbrella, even if they're the ones steering it, Germans with German planes bought from the United States, or they develop one of their own. But that means they're running a second program at that point. If they want to be sovereign, that means a European program independent from the Franco-British program of the French and the English, which they would want to join. Your initial reaction to Poland is negative. Could you explain why you feel this way? Well, on the other hand, I think that stable countries are actually a guarantee of reliability for ensuring security. I know it's not widely accepted, but a country like South Korea, a country like Taiwan, I assure you that we guarantee security, we prevent an invasion of Taiwan. If they had the atomic bomb, they had a nuclear program in the 1970s.
Let's focus on Germany, because what Germany says, well, I'm not sure. Again, it depends on the majority in power. This isn't just bar talk, it goes further than that. If you can't provide nuclear deterrence, you become a pawn in global politics. And he says we need to discuss German or European participation in the nuclear arsenal of France and the United Kingdom, and eventually of our own participation with other European states. It will be costly, but this German leader has calculated that we must finance it to ensure our security. French deterrence is
70 years of work,
of effort, of experience,
before the Germans acquire a credible nuclear force. That's not happening anytime soon.
That's why they want to work with the French and the English to make...
For the Europe of tomorrow, you have to put your ego aside a little. We need to pool our expertise in defense. We, of course, have nuclear capabilities and the umbrella we could provide to the rest of the European Union. This would allow us to have a natural leadership thanks to our experience in this field. Special forces were deployed, followed by a gradual increase in defense forces, conventional and the large metal industry to Germany. Yes, so we need to pool our resources.
But the Germans, especially the Christian Democratic Union, the Christian Democrats, I thought they were in favor of it. Nuclear power was considered haram.
Even the
Enriched uranium at 3.7% used in nuclear power.
enriched.
In power plants, the rods we put in are enriched to 3.7%.
Does their sudden request for uranium enriched to 80% reveal their panicked state? Does that mean they really feel Russia breathing down their necks? They feel the need to find a solution very quickly.
Maybe they need to find a European solution. All right, but I agree, and it's rare, but I agree, and Renaud Vincent does too. Not...
Albania, but you tonight, it will be love.
But it's not Germany's job to do it. If there is a country that has the experience and legitimacy, it's France, not Germany. Germany, as Xavier said, was under the Americans. We're not going to. We, the French, specifically chose this independence thanks to General de Gaulle. It's still very important not to put ourselves under...
Don't you have a bit of anti-German prejudice there? Germany is a great power. It's a nation with a larger population than France.
But they lack the knowledge and experience.
No, but Darius, there was indeed a beginning of very close cooperation between Germany and France, which even extended to defense, etc. It's in the agreement between Adenauer and de Gaulle, the Élysée Treaty in January. It so happens that under the influence of the leader of that same Christian Democratic Party, the German deputies completely dismantled and stripped all meaning from the Élysée Treaty. The German deputies, not Adenauer, who was out of his depth and no longer in power at the time, the German deputies decided to take the American path of submission to America. There you go. And as Xavier or Vincent says, it's been 70 years. That was in 63, so it's been 65 years. All right, there you go. And obviously today the main deterrent is conventional from Aris. Because if tomorrow the Russians, and that's a possibility, attack Narva in Estonia, and we are allies of Estonia, so we are obliged to intervene. Everyone knows that neither the French nor the Germans nor the English will send nuclear bombs. And so what we need is conventional deterrence, because the Russian attack will be conventional, so we need to have conventional deterrence. We need to place preposition brigades in all these Baltic countries that unfortunately could one day be attacked by
Russia. However, similar to the German base in Lithuania, it was a very good idea and initiative, who are protecting this front in a conventional way, which is very important, this conventional deterrence.
But the term Germany, France's pawn, right? Today they're the pawn of the United States. If they wanted to change their status, it could give them the choice to become a country. We may need to renegotiate and reconsider. France is selling Rafale jets to Poland and Germany. We produce nuclear bombs that are not for strategic purposes, maybe tactical ones to replace the United States for actual use, specifically on Narva. We won't destroy Moscow, but we will effectively halt the Russian advance, similar to our actions with the Putin program in the past. In that context, we can imagine other countries joining France as a country that has nuclear capability and delivery systems, but without France's approval in case of use. But today, the military leadership isn't considering or even thinking about that at all.